20 years after divorcing his wife, not knowing she was pregnant, a tech billionaire gets a midnight call that shatters his empire of certainty. Her voice is steady, controlled, devastating. "You have a daughter. She's 19, and she's dying." Without hesitation, he cancels board meetings, abandons acquisition deals, and confronts the most dangerous algorithm he's ever encountered: the human cost of his own cruelty. Let's start with control. Andre Sinclair had built his billion-dollar empire on predictive analytics and absolute certainty, but the calculation he made on fear instead of faith would cost him the only thing his algorithms could never quantify: a daughter's life. The morning began like any other morning in their life together. Nancy Fox moved through their penthouse bedroom with that particular intelligence that had first disrupted Andres' carefully ordered world, her dark eyes catching the early light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She was reading something on her tablet, some research paper about ethical AI that she'd stay up debating with him about later, while organizing his schedule with the kind of precision that made his assistants look careless. "You don't have to do that," Andres said from his workstation, watching her with the kind of partnership that most men never find because they're too afraid to marry their intellectual equal. "I pay 3 people to manage my calendar." She turned, her smile sharp and warm simultaneously. "Your people schedule like they're playing Tetris with your life. I schedule like I actually care whether you eat lunch." That was Nancy. She had a way of cutting through corporate performance to truth, of making a penthouse feel like a collaboration instead of a monument to wealth. When Andres had met her at a tech ethics conference, she'd been presenting a paper that directly challenged his company's data practices. She'd been wearing a blazer that probably cost a fraction of his suit, yet she'd been the most formidable person in the room. Not because of credentials alone, though she held a PhD in computer science, but because of something rarer. She questioned everything. She argued with conviction. She saw through his carefully constructed persona to the insecure genius underneath who was terrified of being ordinary. Their marriage had scandalized his board. His CFO had actually used the phrase reputational liability 11 times in one emergency meeting. His investors had suggested a postnuptial agreement with penalty clauses. But Andres had never been more certain of any acquisition. Nancy wasn't impressed by his wealth. She worked on AI transparency initiatives, testified before Congress about algorithmic bias, and came home with challenges that reminded him technology was power, and power without ethics was just sophisticated exploitation. "What are you calculating?" she asked, catching him staring. "That I made the only illogical decision of my life, and somehow it was the correct one." Romantic. She came to his desk, kissed the top of his head. "I have a Senate subcommittee hearing this morning. Testimony on facial recognition regulations. Take the car. Take security." She laughed. "Andres, I'm going to Capitol Hill, not a war zone. I'll take the metro like a normal citizen." Normal. That word again. Nancy had a way of keeping him human, of reminding him that wealth was responsibility, not insulation. She'd refused to quit her advocacy work when they married, despite his offers to fund any think tank she wanted. "I need to be effective," she'd explained, "not comfortable." He left for his headquarters an hour later, kissing her goodbye at the door like he'd done 1,000 mornings before. He had no way of knowing it would be the last morning that gesture would ever feel innocent. The flash drive arrived at 2 p.m. His head of security brought it in with encrypted protocols, looking tense. "This was delivered by courier to your private office address. No return information." We've scanned it. No malware, but the content. He hesitated. Sir, you should see this privately. Inside were video files, not explicit but surgically damaging. Nancy sitting in a coffee shop with a man Andres didn't recognize. Their conversation animated, intimate in its intellectual intensity. The timestamp suggested they were meeting during hours she'd said she was in research sessions. Another clip showed them in a university laboratory after hours, the man's hand briefly touching her shoulder as they examined something on a screen. A third caught them outside a hotel conference room, standing close, her laughing at something he'd said with the kind of unguarded joy she usually reserved for Andres. Andres's chest constricted with something his algorithms had never predicted. Pure, irrational terror. The accompanying message was text-only. Clinical. Your wife has been meeting Dr. Marcus Chun for 6 months. Pattern analysis suggests 47 encounters. Encryption on her devices increased 300% during this period. Thought you deserved data before public exposure. A concerned stakeholder. His hands went cold. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Nancy had never given him a single data point to suggest deception. But the video sat on his screen like malicious code, and his mind, trained to find patterns to predict threats, began constructing scenarios he couldn't stop. He called his COO, Richard, who arrived within minutes. Richard watched the footage and exhaled slowly. Andres, I hate to say this, but I've seen this pattern before. My partner left me exactly like this. Academic collaboration that became something else. There could be context. Of course there could be. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping into the register of difficult truth. But ask yourself something. A woman with her ideology about wealth inequality, suddenly living in a $30 million penthouse. No post-nup protecting you. What if this whole thing was strategic? What if she's been building leverage from the start? The poison worked instantly. Andres tried calling Nancy, but she didn't answer. She was in her Senate hearing, phones off like always, but his mind, trained to see threats before they materialized, interpreted her silence as confirmation. More files arrived over the next 36 hours. Encrypted email metadata showing regular communication. Hotel key card records with timestamps. A leaked draft of a paper co-authored by Nancy and Dr. Chun, with handwritten margin notes that said, "This changes everything we thought we knew." The handwriting looked like Nancy's, though Andres couldn't be certain without analysis. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He hired a private intelligence firm that came back with reports of regular meetings, always at discrete locations, always with the same man. The firm couldn't confirm infidelity, but they couldn't rule it out either. Their report concluded, subject demonstrates operational security consistent with intentional concealment. When Andres finally confronted Nancy, he'd been awake for 53 hours, his mind running threat models on the only person he'd ever trusted completely. Who is Marcus Chun? His voice was flat, algorithmic, stripped of everything human. Nancy looked up from her laptop, confused. Who? The man you've been meeting. Don't insult my intelligence. I have video evidence. The color drained from her face. Not from guilt, from incomprehension. What are you talking about? He pulled up the files on the screen between them. She watched them slowly, her hands beginning to shake as understanding replaced confusion. When she looked back at him, there was something worse than tears in her eyes. There was recognition that he'd already convicted her. Andres, this is Marcus. He's a research partner I've been collaborating with on the algorithmic accountability framework. These videos are deliberately edited to remove context. Then why didn't you tell me about him? I did. I've mentioned Marcus constantly. You never ask questions because you're not actually interested in my work. You nod and say, that's important, and then go back to your market projections. The accuracy of that should have stopped him cold. But fear, that ancient override of logic, was already executing its program. So it's my fault you're conducting a secret relationship? It's not secret. It's work. We're developing testimony for Congress. We've been meeting with other researchers, legislators, advocacy groups. Andres, look at me. But he couldn't, because looking at her meant seeing his own failure reflected back. The failure to trust, the failure to communicate, the failure to believe that someone could love him without ulterior motive. Chapter 1. Andre Sinclair had never believed in love at first sight until Nancy Fox dismantled his entire worldview in under 7 minutes. It happened at the Global Tech Ethics Summit in Geneva, a gathering where billionaires performed concern about the technologies making them richer. Andres was scheduled to give the opening keynote on responsible innovation, a speech his PR team had crafted to sound visionary while committing to nothing. He was backstage reviewing talking points when he heard a voice from the conference hall, clear and uncompromising, cutting through the usual corporate platitudes like a diagnostic algorithm finding cancer. Mr. Sinclair's company claims to prioritize user privacy while simultaneously patenting surveillance technologies that would make authoritarian regimes salivate. We can't ethics wash our way out of accountability. Either we mean what we say, or we admit we're just better-dressed robber barons. Andres had walked to the stage entrance and seen her. A woman in a burgundy blazer that had probably come from a department store, standing at the audience microphone with the intensity that made everyone in designer suits look like they were playing dress-up. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her posture radiating the confidence of someone who'd done the research and knew she was right. She wasn't performing outrage. She was stating facts, and the facts were damning. He'd abandoned his prepared speech entirely. Instead, he'd walked on stage, pointed directly at her, and said, "You're absolutely correct. Would you like to tell me how to fix it?" The room had gone silent. Nancy had stared at him for 3 long seconds, calculating whether this was a publicity stunt or a genuine question. Then she'd smiled, sharp as code, and said, "Do you have 6 hours and a whiteboard?" They talked for 9. That was 3 years ago, and Andres still couldn't fully explain what made Nancy different from every person who'd tried to get close to him before. She didn't want anything from him except intellectual honesty. She challenged his assumptions about technology, about power, about the responsibility that came with being able to shape human behavior through software. She read his company's patents and identified ethical landmines his legal team had missed. She made him better, smarter, more careful. She made him want to be worthy of her respect. His board had been horrified when he announced the engagement. "She's an activist," his general counsel had warned, as if identifying a virus. "She's testified against companies in our portfolio. This creates conflicts of interest we can't quantify." "Then learn to quantify them," Andres had replied. Nancy had laughed when he told her about the board's concerns. They were in his penthouse overlooking the city, her laptop open to a draft paper on artificial intelligence accountability, his fingers tracing absent patterns on her shoulder while she worked. "They think I'm going to leak your secrets," she'd said, not looking up from her screen. Are you? Only if you do something that deserves leaking. She turned then, her eyes meeting his with perfect clarity. I'm not marrying Andre Sinclair, tech billionaire. I'm marrying Andre Sinclair, the man who stayed up until 4 in the morning redesigning his company's data retention policies because I showed him how they could be weaponized. That's the person I love. The rest is just numbers in an account. He'd proposed to her properly the next morning. No ring because she'd already told him she found diamond engagement rings ethically complicated and symbolically reductive. Instead, he'd offered her something more valuable. A seat on his company's ethics advisory board with full veto power over product launches. She'd said yes before he'd finished explaining the authority it granted her. The wedding had been small, deliberate, perfect. His mother had attended but spent the entire reception explaining to anyone who'd listened that these unconventional marriages rarely survive the reality of lifestyle incompatibility. Nancy had overheard and simply raised her glass in acknowledgement, unbothered by predictions of failure from people who measured love in prenuptial clauses. Your mother thinks I'm a con artist, she'd whispered to Andres during their first dance. My mother thinks everyone without a trust fund is a con artist, he'd replied. It's not personal. Oh, it's absolutely personal. Nancy had smiled against his shoulder. She's terrified I'm going to make you human, she had. And for 3 years Andres had been grateful for it. Nancy had made mornings mean something beyond market openings. She'd made conversations about more than valuations and acquisitions. She'd made him believe that being brilliant didn't require being isolated, that trust wasn't a vulnerability to be managed but a foundation to be built. Until the day that foundation turned out to be constructed on algorithms that had stopped accounting for human sabotage. Chapter 2. The attack began so subtly that Andres didn't recognize it as an attack at all. It started with a single email flagged by his security system as suspicious but not malicious, forwarded to his private account with a subject line that read only, "Transparency." Inside was a screenshot of what appeared to be Nancy's calendar, showing regular recurring meetings labeled simply MC research scheduled during hours she'd told Andres she was working from the university library. The sender's address was scrambled, routed through proxy servers in 6 countries, impossible to trace. Andres had stared at the screenshot for 11 minutes before deleting it. Nancy worked with dozens of researchers. Her calendar was packed with collaborations he rarely asked about because he trusted her completely and because, if he was honest, the granular details of algorithmic ethics policy bored him compared to the architecture of the systems themselves. But he didn't delete the small seed of question that email planted. Why hadn't she mentioned someone important enough to meet with weekly? The second email arrived 3 days later. This time it contained metadata from Nancy's university network access logs, showing she'd accessed restricted research databases at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, hours after she'd told Andres she was going to bed early. The message included only a timestamp and a question mark. Andres had checked his own records that night. He'd been in Tokyo for an acquisition meeting, 9 time zones away. Nancy had texted him at 9:15 p.m., her time saying she was exhausted and going to sleep. The logs said otherwise. He'd almost called her then, almost asked directly. But something stopped him, some equation running in the back of his mind that said, if she's being honest, she'll be hurt that you're questioning her. And if she's not being honest, she'll lie more carefully. So he said nothing, and the silence became its own variable, compounding with each new piece of data. The photographs arrived on a Friday, delivered to his office in a manila envelope with no return address. Andres opened it during a brief window between board meetings, expecting legal documents or acquisition proposals. Instead, he found 8 high-resolution images of Nancy with a man he'd never seen before. Asian, late 30s, wearing academic casual clothing. In one photo they were having coffee, their body language intimate in the way of people who've had the same conversation 100 times. In another, they were walking through a university quad, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. A third showed them outside what appeared to be a hotel, though the angle only captured the entrance and their faces, not what happened next. The envelope also contained a flash drive. Andres plugged it into an isolated system, his hands steady despite the adrenaline starting to flood his bloodstream. The drive held video files with timestamps spanning 6 months. Nancy and the same man, always meeting in places that suggested intentional discretion. Coffee shops in neighborhoods far from her usual patterns. University buildings accessed late at night. One clip showed them in what looked like a private laboratory, her laughing at something he'd said, his hand briefly touching her arm in a gesture that could have been collegial or could have been something else entirely. The final file on the drive was a document, email exchanges extracted from what appeared to be Nancy's university account, though Andres couldn't verify authenticity. The messages discussed our project and keeping this contained until we're ready, and I trust you completely. They were signed with Nancy's digital signature. Andres sat in his office until the cleaning crew arrived at midnight, watching the videos on loop, trying to find the innocent explanation his logical mind insisted must exist. Nancy had never lied to him. Nancy had never given him reason to doubt. But the data kept accumulating, and data didn't lie, and every algorithm he'd ever built said the same thing. When someone changes their patterns, conceals their movements, and maintains secret relationships, there's usually a reason that won't survive sunlight. What Andres didn't know, couldn't have known, was that every piece of evidence had been manufactured by Vance Harrington, his former business partner, a man Andres had forced out of the company 2 years earlier for attempting to sell user data to foreign intelligence services. Vance, who'd spent 18 months studying Nancy's schedule, hiring actors, fabricating metadata, and deep-faking videos with technology sophisticated enough to fool even Andres' security systems. Vance, who understood that the fastest way to destroy a man who'd built his life on certainty was to poison the one thing he'd finally learned to trust without evidence. Love. Chapter 3. Andres didn't ask questions. He issued a verdict. Nancy came home from a congressional briefing on Wednesday evening to find him sitting in the dark living room. Laptop open, the fabricated videos queued and ready like evidence at a trial she didn't know she was attending. She'd barely set down her briefcase before he pressed play. Explain this. She watched herself on screen with a man she'd never met in locations she'd never been. Her face went pale, but not from guilt. From the immediate, terrible understanding that someone had weaponized technology against her, and the person who should have been her first ally had already chosen to be her judge. Andres, this isn't real. These videos have been manipulated. The metadata is authentic. Your university network access confirms the timestamps. Your calendar shows recurring meetings you never mentioned. His voice was surgical, each word precisely calibrated to cut. I had 3 separate forensic analysts verify the files. The probability of comprehensive fabrication is less than 4%. Then I'm the 4%. She moved toward him, hands raised in supplication. I don't know who that man is. I've never been to those locations. Someone is targeting us. Can't you see that? What I see is 6 months of deception. What I see is encrypted communications you thought I'd never find. What I see is a pattern consistent with infidelity conducted by someone smart enough to think she could maintain operational security indefinitely. Operational security? Nancy's voice cracked. You're talking about our marriage like it's a corporate breach. Andres, I love you. I have never, not once, been unfaithful to you. Please, look at me, not the screen. But he couldn't look at her, because looking at her meant acknowledging that his certainty might be wrong, and Andre Sinclair had built an empire on never being wrong. His algorithms didn't make mistakes. His analysis was infallible. And if he was wrong about this, what else had he been wrong about? What other fundamental calculations had he miscalculated? I want a divorce. The words came out flat, automated like a system executing a predetermined command. Nancy stepped back as if he'd physically struck her. You're not even going to investigate? You're not going to ask who might want to destroy us? Andres, you have enemies, corporate rivals, people who would benefit from destabilizing you. Don't insult my intelligence by making this about conspiracy theories. The evidence is conclusive. The evidence is fake. She was crying now, furious and heartbroken simultaneously. And the man I married would have known that. The man I married would have trusted me enough to ask questions before hiring forensic analysts. But maybe I never actually married that man. Maybe I married an algorithm that just looked like a person. He had the divorce papers delivered the next morning. Nancy signed them in a conference room at his attorney's office, her hands steady despite the tears that wouldn't stop falling. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She simply looked at him one final time and said, "When you eventually discover the truth, and you will, remember that I wanted to fight for us. You're the one who chose certainty over faith." Andres watched her leave and told himself he felt nothing but relief at excising a threat from his life. He threw himself into work with the intensity of a man running from something he couldn't name. He acquired 2 companies in 3 weeks. He restructured his executive team. He had Nancy's security clearances revoked and her name removed from every company document as if she'd never existed. What he didn't know was that Nancy had gone directly from signing the divorce papers to her doctor's office, feeling nauseated and exhausted in ways that stress alone didn't explain. The pregnancy test came back positive. 6 weeks. Nancy sat in the examination room, staring at the ultrasound image of the cluster of cells that would become Elise, and made a calculation of her own. Andres had chosen to believe she was a liar and a manipulator. He'd chosen evidence over trust, algorithms over humanity. She would not give him the opportunity to choose whether their child was another variable to be controlled or eliminated. She would raise this baby alone. She would survive whatever came next. And she would never, ever tell Andre Sinclair that he'd destroyed his family based on lies that a 4% margin of error should have made him question. 2 days later, Nancy Fox walked out of the penthouse with 2 suitcases and a secret that would remain buried for 20 years, until the day that biology demanded truths that pride had tried to erase. Chapter 4. Nancy's fall from penthouse to pavement took exactly 43 days. The divorce settlement that should have provided security had been systematically dismantled by Andres's legal team. They'd argued that the marriage had been brief, that Nancy had brought no assets into it, and that her professional activism constituted a conflict of interest that had damaged his company's reputation. The judge, who played golf with Andres's general counsel, agreed. Nancy walked away with $11,000 and her personal belongings. It lasted 3 months. First month, cheap hotel while searching for work. Second month, youth hostel after discovering that every research position, every university fellowship, every think tank opportunity had mysteriously evaporated. Andres's reach was longer than she'd imagined, his vindictiveness more thorough. Third month, her car, sleeping in parking lots, rationing protein bars, and trying not to vomit from morning sickness into fast food restaurant bathrooms. By month 4, Nancy Fox, who'd testified before Congress and held a doctorate in computer science, was living in a women's shelter and discovering that pregnancy made you ineligible for most emergency assistance programs. Too vulnerable for manual labor, not disabled enough for benefits, educated enough that caseworkers assumed she had family resources she was hiding. "You have a PhD," the intake coordinator said, her voice heavy with suspicion. "How exactly did you end up here?" Nancy had learned not to mention the billionaire ex-husband. Nobody believed that story, and the few who did assumed she'd done something to deserve abandonment. So she said nothing and accepted a bunk bed in a room with 7 other women, their belongings kept in plastic bins, their dignity rationed like the donated toiletries they shared. Elise was born at County General Hospital on a November morning that smelled like disinfectant and institutional defeat. Nancy had walked herself to the emergency room at 2 a.m., contractions 7 minutes apart, carrying everything she owned in a backpack. The nurses had been efficient and mostly kind, though one had asked loudly enough for others to hear, "No partner? No family? Nobody at all." "Nobody at all," Nancy had confirmed, and pushed a human being into the world entirely alone. The hospital social worker arrived before Nancy's discharge paperwork. "We have resources for mothers in your situation," she'd said, her tone implying that your situation was a moral failure rather than a circumstance. "Parenting classes, job training, transitional housing if you qualify." Nancy had qualified for a spot in a shelter for single mothers, a converted motel where each family got 1 room and shared kitchen privileges. It was survival barely. She'd found work through a temporary agency, night shifts at a warehouse distribution center that paid $9 an hour and didn't ask questions about gaps in her resume. She worked 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., slept while Elise slept, and survived on food bank donations and the particular kind of exhaustion that makes your bones ache. The other mothers in the shelter taught her things her doctorate hadn't covered: which churches gave out diapers without requiring attendance, which food banks didn't check ID, how to make formula last longer by adding extra water even though it was dangerous, how to smile at caseworkers even when they treated you like a liar, how to absorb humiliation without breaking. Nancy learned to shoplift baby food when the choice was between Elise eating and herself eating. She learned to ignore the looks from women in grocery stores who saw her counting change for a jar of peanut butter. She learned that poverty wasn't just lack of money, it was a full-time job of managing systems designed to ensure you stayed poor, each requirement creating new obstacles, each benefit clawed back the moment you earned $1 over an arbitrary threshold. She learned that her education meant nothing without connections, that her expertise was worthless without someone willing to hire her, that "just get a job" was what people said when they'd never spent 40 hours filling out applications that disappeared into algorithmic screening systems designed to filter out gaps in employment. Most of all, Nancy learned that surviving wasn't noble or character building or redemptive. It was simply brutal, and the only thing that kept her alive was the 6-pound human being who looked at her like she was the entire universe. Unaware that her mother had once been someone who mattered, back when mattering was something Nancy believed money couldn't erase. She'd been wrong about that too. Chapter 5. Elise Sinclair Fox spoke in complete sentences at 18 months and asked questions about probability theory at 4. Nancy discovered her daughter's mind the way most parents discover terminal illness. Suddenly, undeniably, with the immediate understanding that everything was about to become infinitely more complicated. Elise didn't just learn, she consumed information with the kind of systematic intensity that Nancy recognized from her own childhood. From the years before, she'd learned that being the smartest person in the room made you a target as often as it made you valuable. By age 6, Elise was reading at a 10th grade level and teaching herself basic coding using a donated laptop Nancy had received from a church technology drive. By age 8, she'd exhausted the curriculum at her underfunded public school and was spending lunch periods in the library reading computer science textbooks that Nancy checked out using her own expired university credentials. By age 10, she'd built a website that optimized food bank inventory systems and quietly revolutionized how 3 counties distributed emergency resources. Where did I come from? Elise asked one night when she was 7, the question delivered with the same analytical curiosity she applied to every problem. They were in their subsidized apartment, Nancy's 3rd job in as many years, finally providing enough stability for 2 rooms and consistent electricity. Nancy had prepared for this question the way she prepared for everything now, by calculating the least damaging answer. You came from me, and from someone who wasn't ready to be a father. Is he dead?
No.
Does he know about me?
No.
Elise had processed this information with the same methodical approach she used for math problems, filing it away as a variable she couldn't yet solve. She didn't ask again for 3 years. The question returned when Elise was 10, sharpened by increasing awareness of how families were supposed to function. Why doesn't he know about me? Nancy had been folding laundry, the mechanical task giving her hands something to do while her mind searched for truth that wouldn't destroy. Because when people have power and money, they sometimes use it as a weapon. And I needed to protect you from becoming collateral damage. He's rich. Very. And he hurt you? Yes. Then I don't want to know him. Elise had returned to her homework, the matter settled with the kind of absolute judgment only children can render. Nancy had felt relief and guilt in equal measure, grateful that her daughter's loyalty was unquestioning, while knowing that half of Elise's genetic code belonged to a man who'd chosen paranoia over investigation, algorithms over humanity. But DNA doesn't care about narrative choices. Elise inherited Andres's analytical mind, his ability to see patterns in chaos, his relentless need to optimize systems. She inherited Nancy's ethical framework, her commitment to using intelligence for collective good rather than personal advantage. She inherited both their stubbornness, their inability to accept insufficient answers, their capacity for singular focus that bordered on obsession. By age 15, Elise had earned a full scholarship to a prestigious STEM magnet school, her standardized test scores so exceptional that admission counselors initially suspected fraud. By 17, she'd been accepted to MIT with a complete financial aid package. Her essay about building algorithmic solutions for resource distribution in underserved communities landing with the kind of moral clarity that admissions committees claim to want but rarely received. Nancy attended Elise's high school graduation in a dress she'd bought at Goodwill, cleaned and pressed until it looked almost professional. She watched her daughter accept awards for computer science, mathematics, and social innovation, and felt pride mixed with terror. Because Elise was brilliant in ways that would make her visible, and visibility meant vulnerability. And Nancy had spent 18 years trying to keep her daughter hidden from the man whose paranoia had already destroyed one life. "Mom," Elise had said that night. Her acceptance letter to MIT spread on their kitchen table like a treaty. "When I'm successful enough that he can't hurt us anymore, I want to find him. I want him to know what he missed. I want him to see exactly what his cruelty cost." Nancy had said nothing, because what could she say? That revenge was a young person's fantasy? That Andre Sinclair had probably never thought about them again? That the only thing worse than being forgotten was being remembered and still deemed worthless? Instead, she'd hugged her daughter and thought, "You have his eyes, his mind, his relentless need to solve problems that should remain mysteries. And someday, that DNA is going to demand answers that I've spent 2 decades trying to erase." Chapter 6. Elise collapsed in the MIT Hayden Library on a Tuesday afternoon, her face hitting the keyboard hard enough to crack 2 keys. She'd been working on her thesis project, an algorithmic framework for predicting resource scarcity in climate-vulnerable regions, when the nosebleed started. Not unusual, Boston winters were dry, the library overheated, and Elise had been running on 4 hours of sleep and caffeine for the past week. She'd tilted her head back, pressed tissue to her nose, and continued typing one-handed because the deadline was in 6 days and the model wasn't converging properly. The blood didn't stop. It poured down her throat, metallic and wrong, soaking through tissue after tissue until her roommate found her 20 minutes later, semi-conscious and surrounded by red-stained paper like evidence at a crime scene. The ER doctors at Massachusetts General initially treated it as a severe nosebleed complicated by exhaustion. They'd cauterized the vessel, run basic blood work, and were preparing discharge paperwork when the lab results came back. The attending physician had returned to Elise's bay with a different expression. The kind medical professionals wear when they're about to destroy someone's carefully constructed future with a single sentence. "Your platelet count is critically low. We're admitting you immediately." 3 days of testing revealed what the doctors had suspected but hoped they were wrong about. Severe aplastic anemia, an autoimmune disorder where the body systematically destroys its own bone marrow. Elise's marrow was producing almost no new blood cells. Without treatment, her immune system would continue attacking itself until organ failure, infection, or hemorrhage killed her. Best case scenario, the hematologist explained, her voice professionally gentle, "You need a bone marrow transplant. We'll test your mother first, then search the National Registry for matches. The closer the genetic relationship, the better the odds of success." Nancy was tested within hours. She wasn't a match. Not even close. The genetic markers were wrong in ways that confirmed what Nancy had known intellectually but never felt emotionally. Half of Elise's DNA came from someone else, and that someone else was suddenly the difference between life and death. The registry search came back 4 days later. No matches. Elise's particular genetic profile, the specific combination of markers inherited from both parents, was rare enough that finding an unrelated donor could take months or years. Time Elise didn't have. Her platelet count was dropping daily. She'd already required 2 transfusions. The bruises spreading across her skin looked like topographical maps of system failure. "Siblings are the best option," the transplant coordinator said carefully, reviewing Elise's file. "Do you have any other children? Half-siblings would significantly improve our chances." Nancy felt something crack inside her chest, Some protective structure she'd spent 19 years reinforcing finally giving way under pressure it was never designed to withstand. No siblings. What about the biological father? Has he been tested? He doesn't know she exists. The coordinator's expression shifted from clinical to cautiously probing. Ms. Fox, I understand there may be complicated circumstances, but your daughter's life is at stake. If there's any possibility of locating him for testing. He's not difficult to locate. Nancy heard her own voice as if from a great distance, flat and mechanical. Andres Sinclair, the tech billionaire. He's probably in Forbes magazine this month. The coordinator's pen stopped moving. The Andres Sinclair? Yes. And he doesn't know he has a daughter? No. A long silence followed, filled with machines beeping and distant hospital announcements, and the sound of Nancy's carefully constructed life disintegrating into component parts. The coordinator finally spoke, her voice carefully neutral. Ms. Fox, you understand that without a genetic match, your daughter has approximately 6 weeks before we have to consider more aggressive interventions that have significantly lower success rates? Nancy understood. She understood that the man who'd destroyed her life with fabricated evidence and algorithmic certainty was now the only person who could save it. She understood that she would have to call him, explain the daughter he didn't know existed, and beg for help from someone who'd already proven he'd rather trust surveillance footage than the woman he claimed to love. She understood that Andres Sinclair held their daughter's life in his hands, and he didn't even know he was killing her. I'll contact him, Nancy said, and felt the weight of 20 years of protective silence collapse into a single impossible phone call. Chapter 7. Andres Sinclair received the call that would dismantle his entire existence at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, during a video conference with his Hong Kong office about a cryptocurrency acquisition. His personal line rang, the one only 6 people had access to, all of them corporate executives or family members. The caller ID showed a Massachusetts number he didn't recognize. He almost declined it. Later, he would calculate how many times he'd made that exact choice, ignored that exact type of call, and wonder how many other catastrophes he'd narrowly avoided through pure statistical chance. He answered on the 4th ring. Sinclair. Andres. It's Nancy. 20 years collapsed into 2 seconds. Her voice was exactly the same, controlled, intelligent, with that particular clarity that had once made him believe he'd found someone who could match his mind. Except now there was something underneath the control, something that sounded like structural damage barely contained. Nancy. His mouth formed her name automatically while his brain ran through probability matrices trying to determine why she would call after 2 decades of absolute silence. Blackmail. Lawsuit. Some delayed revenge for the divorce. His Hong Kong team continued talking in his earpiece, unaware that his entire attention had just been redirected. I need 5 minutes of your time. It's urgent. I'm in the middle of. Your daughter is dying. The words hit him like corrupted code, syntax that his system couldn't parse. Daughter is dying. The variables didn't connect to any existing data structure in his understanding of reality. I don't have a daughter. Yes, you do. Her name is Elise. She's 19. And she has approximately 6 weeks to live without a bone marrow transplant that requires a genetic match from her biological father. That's you, Andres. You have a daughter, and she's dying because you divorced me before I could tell you I was pregnant. Andres stood up from his desk, his Hong Kong team still talking in his ear like voices from another dimension. He pulled out the earpiece. That's not possible. You would have told you? The man who accused me of infidelity based on fabricated evidence? The man who had me blacklisted from every professional opportunity? The man who looked at me like I was a threat to be neutralized instead of a person to be trusted. Nancy's voice remained steady, surgical in its precision. I made a calculation, Andres. I decided that raising a child in poverty was safer than giving you the opportunity to weaponize her existence against me. I was wrong about many things, but I wasn't wrong about you. If this is some kind of... It's not blackmail. It's not revenge. It's biology. Elise has severe aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow is destroying itself. I'm not a genetic match. The National Registry has no matches. You're her only option. Nancy paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried 20 years of accumulated damage. I'm not asking you to be her father. I'm not asking you to atone for destroying my life. I'm asking you to get tested to see if your bone marrow is compatible with the daughter you didn't know existed. After that, you can go back to your empire and your certainty and your algorithms that are always right. But first, you have to help me save her life. Andres sat down slowly, his hand gripping the edge of his desk hard enough to hurt. His mind, trained to find patterns in chaos, searched desperately for the logic that would make this information false. A scam, a sophisticated attack, some elaborate revenge scheme coordinated by competitors. Prove it. I'll email you her medical records, her birth certificate, a photograph. Nancy's voice finally cracked, just slightly. You want DNA confirmation? Fine. Get tested for compatibility and the results will show paternity. You want more proof? Look at her, Andres. She has your eyes, your mind, your relentless need to fix systems that are broken. She's everything you are, except she uses her intelligence to help people instead of control them. Where is she? Massachusetts General Hospital, Boston. Room 847. Nancy took a breath that sounded like it hurt. The transplant coordinator is Dr. Sarah Chin. She's expecting your call. Elise doesn't know I'm contacting you. She thinks her father is dead because that was easier than explaining that he's alive and chose to believe lies about me instead of asking questions. Nancy, don't. The word was sharp, final. Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't tell me you were manipulated or confused or acting on evidence. You destroyed me because it was easier than trusting me. Now you get to decide whether you're going to let that same pride kill your daughter. The choice is yours, Andres. It always was. She hung up before he could respond. Andres sat in his office, surrounded by screens displaying real-time data from markets across the world, and felt his carefully constructed reality fragment into component parts that no algorithm could reassemble. He had a daughter. She was dying. And for the first time in 20 years, Andre Sinclair had no idea what certainty looked like. Chapter 8. Andres flew to Boston on his private jet and arrived at Massachusetts General Hospital carrying nothing but a DNA test he'd commissioned during the flight and a daughter's medical file he'd memorized like code. The genetic testing confirmed what Nancy had said with mathematical certainty: 99.97% probability of paternity. Elise Sinclair Fox shared exactly half his genetic markers, inheriting his tissue type with enough compatibility that Dr. Chun called it remarkably fortunate. Andres learned he had a daughter and discovered he could save her in the same 30-minute consultation. information delivered with clinical efficiency that left no space for the emotional reckoning happening in his chest. The procedure is relatively straightforward, Dr. Chen explained, pulling up imaging on her screen. We'll harvest bone marrow from your pelvic bone under general anesthesia. You'll be unconscious. Recovery is typically 1 to 2 weeks of soreness and fatigue. What are the risks? Minimal for donors. Anesthesia complications, infection, bleeding, standard surgical risks. And for her, Dr. Chen's expression shifted slightly. More complex. Her body has to accept your marrow without mounting an immune response. Graft versus host disease is the primary concern. We'll use immunosuppressants, but there's always risk of rejection. Probability of success? With a parent donor of your compatibility? Approximately 73% full recovery, 18% partial improvement, 9% rejection or complications. Andres processed the numbers the way he processed every decision, as acceptable risk weighted against alternative outcomes. Without transplant, Elisa's probability of survival was essentially 0. With transplant, she had a statistical chance. The calculation was simple. The emotional weight of it was incalculable. Schedule it immediately. He met Elise 2 hours before the procedure, a meeting Dr. Chan arranged over Nancy's objections. She was in her hospital room, pale and bruised, for lines running from both arms, reading a textbook on machine learning algorithms. When Andres entered, she looked up with eyes that were genetically his own and said, "So you're the algorithm that made me." No greeting. No emotion. Just observation delivered with the same analytical distance Andres had used his entire life. I'm your father. Biologically accurate. Functionally irrelevant. Elise closed her book. My mother says you're here to donate marrow. I appreciate the genetic compatibility. After this, you can return to whatever life you've built pretending we don't exist. Elise, don't. Her voice was Nancy's voice, sharp and absolute. You don't get to be my father by showing up when biology forces you to. You get to be my donor. That's the extent of our relationship. Are we clear? Andres nodded, unable to form words around the thing lodged in his throat that felt like every mistake he'd ever made compressed into a single moment of recognition. She was brilliant, damaged, and completely correct in her assessment. He'd earned nothing but her contempt. The surgery happened at 6 a.m. Andres went under anesthesia thinking about probability distributions and woke up 4 hours later to complications no one had predicted. The extraction had gone perfectly, but Andres's blood pressure had dropped catastrophically during recovery. Internal bleeding from the harvest site, rare but not impossible. The surgical team had gone back in, cauterized vessels, transfused blood. He'd been unconscious for the crisis, waking only after stabilization to find Dr. Chan at his bedside explaining that he'd lost significant blood volume and would need extended monitoring. You nearly died, she said simply. Your body responded poorly to the anesthesia. We've stabilized you, but you'll be here for at least a week. Andres felt pain radiating from his hip in waves, sharp and relentless, the kind of physical suffering he'd spent his life avoiding through wealth and control. This was what vulnerability felt like. This was what sacrifice demanded. Not algorithmic calculation, but actual bodily cost. Blood and bone given to repair damage that pride had created. And Elise, receiving your marrow now. The transplant is proceeding as planned. We'll know within 72 hours if her body accepts it. Andres closed his eyes and calculated nothing. For the first time in his adult life, he simply waited, helpless and human, while biology determined whether redemption was even possible or if some mistakes were too profound for even DNA to repair. Chapter 9. Elisa's body accepted the transplant on day 4, her bone marrow beginning to produce healthy blood cells with efficiency that Dr. Chun called textbook perfect. Andres learned this from a nurse, not from Nancy, who hadn't spoken to him since his arrival. He was still hospitalized 3 floors below his daughter, recovering from complications that had extended his stay to 9 days, when the message came through his phone. Engraftment successful. Elise is stable. You can go home now. No gratitude. No acknowledgement. Just permission to leave, delivered like a system notification. He didn't leave. Instead, he spent another week in Boston, staying at a hotel across from the hospital, receiving daily updates from medical staff, while Nancy maintained a perimeter around Elise that he was not invited to cross. He watched from a distance as his daughter grew stronger, color returning to her skin, bruises fading, her body slowly rebuilding itself from his genetic material while refusing any other connection. On day 16, Elise agreed to see him, not because Nancy encouraged it, but because Elise approached relationships like she approached algorithms, methodically with clear parameters and defined boundaries. "You have 15 minutes, she said when he entered her room. She was sitting up, textbook open, looking healthier but no less guarded. "I've calculated that's sufficient time for the conversation we need to have." Andres sat in the visitor's chair, acutely aware that he was being granted an audience, not a relationship. "I want to explain. I know what happened. Mom told me everything. The fabricated evidence. Your paranoia. The divorce." Elisa's voice was matter-of-fact, clinical. "You were manipulated by a business rival named Vance Harrington. Mom had investigators verify it years ago. The videos were deepfakes, sophisticated for their time but detectable with proper analysis. You had the resources to investigate properly. You chose not to. I was wrong. Yes, you were." Elise closed her book. "Here's what I need you to understand. You saved my life. I'm grateful for that. But genetic material doesn't create paternity. You're my biological father. You'll never be my dad. Those are different categories with different requirements, and you haven't met any of the requirements for the second one." Andres felt something fracture that was worse than physical pain. What would those requirements be? Time, trust, presence, none of which can be retroactively applied. Elise tilted her head, studying him with curiosity that was intellectual rather than emotional. "But I'm willing to know you, carefully, at my pace. If you can accept that knowing me doesn't give you rights to me, I accept those terms. Good. Then you can start by answering one question. If Mom hadn't called, if I wasn't dying, would you have ever looked for us?" The question was surgical, designed to expose exactly what Andres was. He could have lied, could have constructed some narrative about planning to investigate, about regret that had haunted him. Instead, he chose the only thing he hadn't given Nancy 20 years ago: truth. "No. I convinced myself you'd betrayed me, and I never questioned that conviction. I built an empire on being right, and admitting I'd been wrong about you would have meant admitting I was capable of catastrophic failure. So I didn't look. I didn't wonder. I erased you completely and called it moving forward. Elise nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed a hypothesis. Thank you for being honest. You can go now. Nancy found him in the hospital parking garage an hour later. She looked exhausted, older than 20 years should have made her, wearing scrubs she'd borrowed from a nurse friend and carrying the weight of 2 decades of survival without assistance. She'll let you know her when she's ready, Nancy said. Don't push. Don't try to buy your way into her life. Don't think that money fixes what you broke. I know. Do you? Nancy stepped closer, her voice dropping. You destroyed me because you trusted algorithms over humanity. You nearly killed our daughter through absence. You don't get redemption, Andres. You get consequences. And if you're very, very lucky, and if you spend the rest of your life earning it, you might eventually get basic civility from a daughter who survived despite you, not because of you. What do you want from me, Nancy? Nothing. I wanted a partner who trusted me 20 years ago. That opportunity expired. She turned to leave, then paused. But Elise might want something eventually. A college fund she didn't have to earn through scholarships. Medical coverage that doesn't come from emergency Medicaid. A father who shows up consistently and asks for nothing in return. If you can manage that, if you can be useful without being controlling, then maybe in a decade or two she'll let you call yourself her father. But that's her choice. Not yours. Never yours. Nancy walked away, and Andres stood in the parking garage calculating the cost of every decision he'd ever made. The transplant had saved Elisa's life but couldn't repair 20 years of absence. The truth had been revealed but couldn't erase 2 decades of consequences. He had a daughter who would never fully be his, an ex-wife who would never forgive him, and a future defined entirely by whether he could learn to value connection over control. Redemption, Andres learned, wasn't something you earned through grand gestures or genetic compatibility. It was something you built slowly, painfully, one boundary respected at a time, with no guarantee that the structure would ever be strong enough to bear the weight of what you destroyed.